You can lose money and recover. You can lose opportunities and find new ones. You can lose a job and eventually get another one. You can lose a relationship and still rebuild your life. But there is one thing you can't afford to lose, because the moment you lose it, everything else becomes harder. Getting out of the bed becomes harder. Moving forward becomes harder. Trusting God becomes harder. Facing challenges becomes harder. The one thing you can't afford to lose is hope, because hope is what keeps people moving when life gives them a reason to quit. And the enemy knows that. That's why one of his favorite goals isn't always to destroy you. Sometimes it's simply to convince you that nothing will ever change. Most people don't lose hope all at once. It happens slowly, one disappointment, then another, one unanswered prayer, then another, one setback, then another. Eventually, you become tired, not physically, emotionally, mentally, spiritually. You start expecting disappointment before it happens. You stop getting excited about possibilities. You stop dreaming like you used to. Not because you are lazy, not because you don't care, but because disappointment has worn you down. And if you've been there, you know how dangerous it is. Because when hope starts dying, motivation usually dies with it. The reason people lose hope is because they start measuring God's faithfulness by their circumstances. If life is going well, they feel hopeful. If life is difficult, hope begins disappearing. But circumstances change constantly. Some days are good, some days make sense, some don't. If your hope constantly depends on circumstances, your hope will rise and fall. Real hope has to be built on something stronger, something more reliable than what's happening around you. Because life will always have challenges. The question is whether your hope can survive them. Think about Joseph. If anyone has a reason to lose hope, it was him. God gave him a dream. Then his brothers betrayed him. He was thrown into the pit, sold into slavery, falsely accused, then thrown into prison, forgotten. Imagine sitting in that prison cell, years after year, watching life pass, wondering if the dream God gave you was ever real. But Joseph kept going, and here's what's amazing. God was working even when Joseph couldn't see it. The prison wasn't the end, it was preparation. The delay wasn't abandonment, it was part of the process. And eventually, the very thing that looked like a setback became a path to God's purpose. There's one thing I've noticed throughout the Bible. God often works in ways that don't make sense in the moment. David was anointed king and yet spent years running for his life. Abraham received the promise and then waited decades. Moses spent 40 years in the wilderness before stepping into his calling. If these people judged God only by what they could immediately see, they would have lost hope. But God's work is usually happening behind the scenes before we could see the result. And maybe that's exactly what's happening in your life right now. The real battle isn't always your circumstances. Sometimes the real battle is protecting your hope while you're going through them. Because once people lose hope, they stop trying, they stop believing, they stop praying, they stop trusting, they stop expecting God to move. And that's exactly where the enemy wants them. Not necessarily destroyed, just discouraged enough to quit. One bad season of life doesn't mean your entire story is bad. One failure doesn't mean you're a failure. One disappointment doesn't mean your future is disappointing. One unanswered prayer doesn't mean God isn't listening. Too many people take one difficult chapter and act like it's the entire book. But God isn't finished writing your story. And unfinished stories are dangerous to judge too early. One of the fastest ways to rebuild hope is to remember the prayers God has already answered. Remember the situation God already brought you through. Remember the moment you thought you wouldn't make it, but somehow you did. Because when you are discouraged, your mind tends to forget God's faithfulness. It only focuses on what's wrong, only on what's missing, only on what's difficult. That's why remembering matters. What you repeatedly listen to affects how you think, and how you think affects how you live. If you constantly feed fear, hopelessness will grow. If you constantly feed faith, hope grows. If you are constantly feeding negativity, discouragement grows. You cannot spend all day rehearsing worst case scenarios and expecting to feel hopeful. Eventually, your mind starts believing what you constantly feed it. Maybe you're watching this and your hope feels weaker than it used to. Maybe you've been carrying disappointment for a long time. Maybe you've prayed prayers that still haven't been unanswered. Maybe you're tired of waiting, tired of wondering, tired of hoping. If that's you, hear this. The fact that you're still here means the story isn't over. David's story wasn't over in the cave. Joseph's story wasn't over in the prison. Abraham's story wasn't over during the waiting. And your story isn't over either. The chapters you are in today may be difficult, but it's still just a chapter, not the entire story. So guide your hope, protect it, fight for it, because hope isn't just a nice feeling. It's fuel. It's what keeps you moving when life gets hard. It's what helps you keep trusting God when answers are delayed. And it's what reminds you that today's situation is not the final chapter. You can recover from many losses in life, but the one thing you can't afford to lose is hope. Because as long as hope remains, there's still a reason to keep moving forward. And as long as God is still involved in your story, there's always a reason to hope.